what does it mean to have food systems that are relying on our local environments, where we are responsible for the things that exist around us, instead of calling lawn doctor or whoever to come cut our grass and fertilize, and who cares what runs off and all of these types of things. There's some agency in that decision, where we actually understand the complexity of these things that have been really turned into transactional relationships of, well, if I pay $50 a month, my grass is green and I don't have to worry about it. It's a much more complicated conversation than that.
Let's find out. Let's find out. We're recording.
Oh shit.
Oh crap! What was this about? How do we start these things?
I don't know. Did you see the news that the guy who made the Starties got picked up by Games Workshop?
I did see that.
Yeah.
That good way to start it.
Yeah.
So
we
okay.
talked about that a while, like very early episode.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about these.
What's his name? Is like I'm probably gonna mispronounce it, but it's like Sima Peterson, Sayama Peterson,
I have no idea.
Something Peterson.
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
How do you feel about that? So
It's a curious one, isn't it? Like, obviously, when anybody ever takes their independent projects and sort of like lets it get absorbed into a big machine, you
especially Games
automatically,
Workshop.
particularly Games Workshop, you automatically think, oh god, what strings are going to be attached? And you have to, I suppose, to some extent. For some reason, I have this sense that this person, who I have no idea who they are, I don't even know their name. Yeah, this parasocial relationship I have with this person who's made this incredible piece of sort of like Warhammer 40,000 themed fan art, which actually happens to be the best sort of like animated, or the best
depiction,
best depiction of the Warhammer 40,000 universe in basically any moving medium.
Any medium at all.
Any medium at
insane.
all. And it was a sort of single-handed, like a one-man job kind of thing. Or a very small team effort.
Well, they could say very small man.
One
Maybe.
very small man. My parasocial relationship with my temple is convinced me that this person is in fact quite short. But I'm sure a king.
A king. A king nonetheless.
And so so what I was going to say was, I sort of imagine I imagine this person as having great integrity.
Sure, me too.
But I also would not fault them for taking a big check.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So that's what's got me wondering. I don't know if his Patreon is still going. I should have checked, but it's like his Patreon was insane, the amount of money he was making.
Yeah, there wasn't any need to.
And so maybe it's just that he just always wanted to work with Games Workshop, because they are doing something new, right? Where they're bringing on a bunch of other animators as well.
I mean, I think they've developed. They've brought on lots of people from different projects, I think, and I think they intend to. They're going to host lots of videos on. I think they're moving all the Astartes stuff onto a specific website that's part of like Games Workshop's website, and then. I think they probably hope to develop quite a lot of animated content.
Did you see the trailer?
I don't know anything about this really, but I suppose even if you have a lot of money, there's a certain amount of just like setting up.
Sure.
Using that money to, if supposing you were going to like set up your own studio.
Yeah, maybe they offered him like resources.
So much work. Yeah, I mean like so much like knowledge and time and resources that could just.
Yeah.
Like maybe what's happening is just. Handed the Games Workshop the job of making
exactly.
him
Did you see the trailer for the Tau one? There's one where it's like a Tau.
Yeah, with like a crisis suit kind of thing. There was very little content in that video.
It was just like a scared looking Tau. Like,
yeah.
And that was about it.
I don't think he looked very much like what I think Tau looked like.
I don't know what I think Tau looked like, because every time I see a depiction of them, I'm like,
maybe they're always different.
It's kind of weird. I'm coming around though. I'm coming around to think they're cool, because like I used to just kind of be like, but now I'm going, I don't know. I
guess some people feel that it's sort of the oddballs of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So do they sort of fit somehow?
But I think there's a point to that, to them being the oddballs. I don't know. Maybe there isn't, but it's like, it's cool seeing that like difference, because you do kind of at first glance go, oh, they're kind of like the closest thing you have to a good guys, and then you're like, are they? And then the fact that they're so different is cool. I don't know.
Yeah, they are the relief into which
Yeah.
the relief to which the rest of the Warhammer 40,000 universe is
Yeah.
sort of like compared, kind of thing. And looking into that, well, my understanding of their backstory from what I learned, I guess like nearly 2 decades ago now, when they came out, when they were released
Last year.
for the first time. Or was it last year? Okay. Who knows?
Well, I'm stoked.
Yeah, from what I know of their story, like the story is designed to be like
Yeah.
this new race that's suddenly appeared, and
Dude, I want to see the Astartes guy. I want to see the orcs. I just want to see the orcs. That depiction of the orcs, the like 2 seconds that we got, was so cool. Oh my god, they were just going nuts on some Space Marine. Good stuff. Love it. Our friends. Should I have with some farming?
yeah.
What else? I don't know. I got anything else.
We're going to the aggro world.
We're going into the aggro world. Royal listener, do we have a treat for you this week?
One hell of a show.
We do have one hell of a show. It's pretty wild. It's pretty awesome. Talk about all sorts of good stuff. We have an interview with Andy and Elliot from the PoorProles Almanac podcast, which Dan introduced me to a little while ago now, and it's been one of my favorites ever since.
Yeah. A legit favourite of both of ours.
A podcast favorite. In more ways than one, I guess.
Yeah. A podcast favourite podcast.
Yeah.
The podcast is podcast.
It's a podcast for podcasters.
No, it's definitely not. What an obnoxious podcast that would be.
Yeah, that would be horrible.
It definitely exists. It definitely
The
exists.
podcast about making a podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's great. PoorProles Almanac, for those of you who might not be listening to it, is a show about, I suppose, half prepping for capitalist collapse, what that would look like, but also just like self-organization, self-determinists, it's just like what's the word? Like there is a word for it, and I'm blanking on it. Self-empowerment, I suppose, is a good way of putting it. About how to grow your own food, how to have a farm, how to protect yourself, how to organize and protect your community. It's praxis, folks.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention this in the interview, but like one of its standout qualities for me is that it's based around building people's capacities.
Yeah.
To look after themselves and the people around them. It's a weird one because, like, I mean, it's a podcast that differs from ours in so many ways. Like, ours is incredibly ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants, very low preparedness.
Very much so.
And theirs is sort of incredibly well prepared and produced and incredibly
researched
dense, incredibly well researched, dense with information.
Yeah.
Incredibly practical, whereas ours is relatively theoretical.
Sure. Yeah.
And also coming from a different part of the old left spectrum in terms of sort of political differences. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
More anarchistic in its sort of theme and theoretical basis. But I do think, although there's a certain amount of coming up questions from different directions, like we're all, but in a broad sense, like there is people from across the kind of like spectrum of left ideologies, for want of a better of a phrase, are all like striving after answers to some of the same questions.
Sure.
Whether it's how to do organizing, how to build up people's capacities, how to replace the state and its sort of like repressive apparatuses, and with what tools and structures and organizations would we do that with, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's different positions and there's different areas of focus for sure, but a great deal of overlap, I think, as well. And
absolutely. Mainly overlap.
Yes,
I would say.
Quite.
If you're kind of like a very dogmatic Marxist, perhaps, or a dogmatic communist, or I don't know, whatever, you're very stuck in your ways. Go give their show a listen, because it is my favorite show right now. It's so good, and I mentioned this, I think, in the episode. I kind of forget because I haven't edited it yet, so maybe I don't say this, but it is really good for dealing with your anxieties about capitalism. Because as I say, recently I had a bit of a apocalyptic is the world about to end moment, and Dana to talk me down a little bit. And this show is really good to help you develop the qualities that you need to kind of get past that anxiety and to prepare for whatever could come, but also just like take a deep breath, step back, and just help your community and help yourself. So that's really what it's all about, I guess.
Yes, I would highly recommend. I mean, their pitch is that you go and listen to the first episode because their content is very additive and it builds upon the content that's come in previous episodes.
First episode's a little scary.
I highly recommend going to listen to the first episode, even if that's only as far as you go. In that, it is, as you say, quite a scary and quite a sobering account of the ecological crisis in which we find ourselves, but it's one that's presented in a way that you don't often come across. Covers really quite the longue durée of sort of like
what we're up against, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And puts it well, I mean, the longue durée of history, I suppose.
Oh, sure.
And puts the history of Earth's climate in specific context, and uses a conceptual framework that you might not have come across before to explain quite the degree of crisis. And if you want some help, I'm sure you're going to need some help. If you want some help in interpreting some of the things that we've been striving after in our last couple of episodes on ecology, much greater clarity is going to come from listening to that first episode of the PoorProles Almanac podcast than
absolutely
our meager efforts.
Absolutely. And ecology, something we should all be thinking about. And I don't know. Maybe what do we talk about? So we talk about soil health. We talk about gardening, farming, chickens. We talk about compost. We talk about guns, chicken tractors. A lot about chicken tractors. And the conversation about guns is really good. So stick around for that. That's at the end, about kind of like where should we be falling as like workers on like the, I don't know, spectrum of like gun rights versus like no guns, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's a conversation that I think we'd like to develop over some episodes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Both sort of like the practical implications of gun ownership. Obviously, in this country, we don't have that right, in quotes. And also like it's a different political context.
Sure.
Although I think there's probably some overlap between people's intuitions in this country and the intuitions of sort of the liberal left in America, which sort of, for obvious reason, I would say for obvious reason, has sort of like developed this sort of like gun skeptic or anti-gun
absolutely
position. But so there's this sort of like, there's that sense of like the immediate consequences of gun ownership, and then also broader questions of like what you would do to replace some of those, some of the sort of like enforcement apparatuses of the present state in a new state. And they're sort of like deep, important questions that we should be moving to sort of think about.
Absolutely, how you can protect your community and like even just like the practical of like, okay, you bought a gun, now what? Because you'll hear them talk about it here in just a moment, but they basically just make the point. It's like that should be the last thing that you ever like think of using in any situation. So it isn't just to like everybody go buy guns. It's not really going to solve too much, but anyway, we'll get to that. We'll get to all of that. Thank you so much to Andy and Elliot for coming on the show. I had an awesome time.
Yes, such just two great open guys. Like so willing to talk about the stuff.
Very knowledgeable as well. And yes, go grow some stuff, everybody, and enjoy this episode. We were just kind of thinking like a good place to start it off is Dan and I have an allotment over here, and we were over there today working on some compost, working on some no-dig beds, and we were kind of wondering like seasonally, like where are you guys at? Like what are you working on your farms and your gardens? What do you got going on right now?
Yeah, so I just got a shipment of 50 raspberries that are leafing out already, and the ground is hard as a rock, so I have no place to put any of these 50 raspberries. So I'm trying to figure out, and they all have some roots, so I can't just stick them in like a little cup or something like that. So I'm just kind of trying to figure that out right now, and I've got turkey eggs going right now in the incubator.
Beautiful.
baby chicks. Yeah, so it's a little bit, it's almost that chaotic time. My sheep are miserable because I need to shave them because it gets hot during the day, but it's still freezing at night. It's just, good time all around.
Yeah, and me personally, I don't have anything going on right now because my wife and I were trying to decide if we were actually going to stay in the house that we have currently or if we were going to try to move. But the house inventory is kind of dictated that we stay. And we kind of decided a bit too late in the season for me to get anything started. But I am going to build some hoop houses and stuff, hopefully this summer and into the fall, and get ready for next spring and see what I can do.
And we're going to do some chicken tractors here.
Hopefully going to try a chicken tractor.
Chicken tractor? What's a chicken tractor?
So it's
sounds sick.
Yeah, so you can get in different sizes, but the one I make for myself and I'll make for him, or we'll work together on, is about 4x8, and you can set it up so it has about 4 laying chicks in it, and you just move it every day and throw in a little bit of feed depending on the chicken type that you have.
That's it.
So if you use some meat chickens, you can do it 10, 12, 15 weeks, depending on what you go with. If you go with an heirloom, it takes longer, like 18 weeks.
And ideally, you can move it around the yard, and they will fertilize and take care of all the bugs and ticks and stuff like that. That would most likely get into your garden and do a little bit of damage. They'll take care of that. You just have to move it. What do you move it? Once every couple of days or once a day?
Yeah, I do usually do every day.
Yeah.
So
that's it.
We'll give it a shot.
I was going to ask you guys, I heard on one of your episodes that you've been raising your chickens with little to no feed. How do you guys do that? Is it just through them just eating bugs or whatever?
Yeah, so I free range my birds. I do some chicken tractors. Usually with chicken tractors you can't do it without feed. But during the summer I don't feed them at all. Usually when winter comes around I do supplement a bit. I'll grow sunflowers and then ferment some sunflower seeds and things like that.
Cool.
I'll use some regular feed. My wife thinks I'm insane, but I'm very interested in buying a pelletizer so you can make your own pellets, which she's like, you're absolutely fucking nuts. And but I want to do a lot more. I have mulberry trees in my yard, and the leaves are about 20% protein. So they're
cool.
The perfect food, but it's not something they're going to go out and eat. So I'm curious if I pelletized it, instead of just giving it to my sheep, I could also give it to my chickens, because their feed is usually between 16 and 21% protein, depending on what you're trying to do with them. So I'm curious if that would actually work. I could not find anyone that's ever done that. So I might buy a $1,000 machine and break it the first time I use it. We'll find out.
I've never had a
chicken. Pretty good if it works.
Yeah, I've never had a chicken before, so he keeps trying to talk me into getting a chicken tractor, and he'll probably try to talk me into getting a goat.
I 100% will not talk you into a goat.
Okay.
I'll talk you into a sheep.
A sheep?
Yes.
Icelandic sheep.
I'm a big fan of Icelandics.
That's because the region we live in, I guess. Cool. He's been trying to talk me into all sorts of animals and stuff. I'm new to all of this, so it's stuff that we've talked about before and had conversations, and I think that's sort of how we started in the podcast. We
kind of have different backgrounds, and together we make one cohesive conversation.
Right, we're weirdly interested in sort of the same things. He's doing it from a standpoint where he wants to try all of it, and I'm just sort of curious as to I love cooking, and it started with understanding where my ingredients and food came from, and it got into the science behind growing food and all of this, and it opened up a whole new concept for me to just kind of dive into. So I'm just bored, I guess.
Yeah, join the club. Would you guys just tell us, right, real quick, just kind of the conceit behind the show and
sure.
what you guys are going for? You kind of started it there, but
yeah. So the PoorProles Almanac was a conversation we had. We were on a road trip for an unfortunate event. A friend of ours had passed away, and we were just kind of chit-chatting. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the podcast It Could Happen Here. Robert Evans. It's a highly, highly recommend. If there's one podcast you ever listen to in your life, that is it. But we were kind of talking about how everything just seems awful in the world. And I was like, oh, you got to listen to this podcast. And it's essentially about how collapse could happen here in the United States. and what that would look like from somebody that had spent time as a journalist in the Middle East. And after that, we were just kind of like talking, and I was already farming, and we were just kind of like chit-chatting, and I had some exposure to guns, but I didn't have a ton, and he has an extensive background in weapons, and we're both like, I guess, acutely aware of the conditions right now in our country as well as across the globe.
Well, basically, I framed the question of, it's kind of a shit show right now, and where do we get started on not relying on somebody else coming to give us answers or save us, but where do we start ourselves, and how do we, find that self-determination? We use that phrase a lot. And how do we use our abilities and our knowledge to improve, our livelihood in our community, without, waiting for permission or waiting for somebody to say that it's okay to improve your surroundings. I feel like a lot of people are kind of not stuck, but just sort of paralyzed by the feeling that, oh, I could change, my whole way of life, and it's not going to change the world. But that's not really our approach. And I was just sort of under the impression, maybe I was audacious in thinking that the conversations that we were having on how to get started might be other conversations that people would be interested in having. And so,
I said, no way, no one wants to listen to us talk.
Right. And I didn't want to get a microphone just so I could hear myself like speak. Like I hate the way my voice sounds on recording, but I felt that the conversations we were having are a good starting point, or at least a good starting point for people to hear, and maybe it will spark their curiosity in either learning more information or just being interested in, what can I do, or what ideas can I get that will make me feel better about what I'm doing with my life, rather than what I was doing, which is just getting up and going to work and trying to make it and scratch by, and the rat race. I was trying to figure out the things that I can do to improve my situation without being overburdened. But instead I started a podcast, and Andy started giving me homework, and now I have 2 jobs and I only get paid for 1.
Yeah, sorry.
So here we are.
Yeah, let me ask you something about that. When I first started listening to your show, like, the main thing that I was hit with was like, kind of like this reason that you guys are doing all this like prepping stuff, and like, like mutual aid and all this kind of stuff. Like, there are like a million beneficial reasons, right? But the one that really stuck out to me was like, man, it puts you in such a better mindset for like knowing not only like what could happen, but just like all this anxiety that we all constantly carry around with us, whether it's for like work insecurity, or like how much you hate your job, or like, something not related to work, or just like a million things related to work. Like, it really kind of seems like it puts you in a better mindset.
Right. And I had the conversation with my wife earlier today about taking, your energy and all that pent up aggression and pent up energy. If you don't have a hobby on an outlet or anything to channel your energy towards, if you can't do anything, just find something constructive to do, because in the long run, that's always going to be, it's always going to have a positive outcome, rather than being destructive or anything like that. And that's a very, broad statement. But what I mean by that is, if you feel like you're trapped or can't do anything, your best bet is to start simple, start small, and be constructive and build your way up, because that's the only way you get out of that there's nothing I can do mindset. You just have to start at the basics, baby steps, educate, and then go for it. So that's pretty much what we did with the podcast. I listened to a couple of podcasts here and there for the past couple of years. Never in my life did I think I would have one, but I sort of spitballed the idea. Andy came back to me a couple of months later and was like, we just buried a good friend, so why would we wait with an idea like this? Why don't we do it? And like I said, I've been reading since, trying to figure out what the hell I'm talking about when there's a microphone in my face.
Right on, that's sick. I got a million questions, but Dan, I'm going to pass it over to you. I know we got some stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, one of the things that's most inspiring about your guys' podcast is quite how it's designed to build people's capacities, kind of thing. And to sort of start with that, what can I do? What knowledge do I need to begin to develop? Because I think you're really right, Elliot. Like, it's very easy to get overwhelmed in how do I position myself, particularly if I'm kind of the the place where our podcast is coming from, and particularly where my sort of thinking is coming from, is much more like maybe like a Marxist socialist kind of background of like, how do we rebuild a workers' movement kind of thing. And it feels like it demands quite a lot of you to like go into your workplaces necessarily, or go to people that you don't necessarily have like perhaps like organic connections with, and make that case. Whereas like it feels like the space you're coming from is much more involved around like the community that you're around, and like people's like commitment to that kind of thing.
Right, and your approach brings another level of complexity and organization involved in this movement, and it's another step to it for sure. But I think in the situation that we're in over here, I think it's much smaller baby steps that we have to get started on, because the proof has to be in the pudding, and I feel like we have to do it and make it work and say, see, there's another way to live, rather than preach there's another way to live, we can do it, like just come with me sort of mentality. Like I feel like there's a lot of that, and I think that's why our episodes have sort of been a bit more academic or sort of lecture-y rather than conversations, but only because we're trying to frame the information so that we can apply it to what's happening today, rather than just preaching on a soapbox saying this is what you have to do, like trust us, like we're the only ones that are right, our opinion is this and that. Like we're trying to frame the conversation and make it so that it's easily digestible, so that people can, find a place to start.
Yeah. That's something that I've noticed, like particularly around the episodes around like ecology and agriculture and that kind of thing. Like you suddenly like, I don't have to absorb all this information now, but it's so listenable that I kind of know it's the starting point. I know where to go to if I want to try and find something, or like something jumps into my head. Oh, I've heard Andy mentioned these concepts for this sort of like, I've got this tree and like, what am I going to do? I'm going to try and plant it. How am I going to like, there's a spark of an idea, and you have somewhere to go, some direction kind of thing.
Yeah, and the goal has been kind of around that idea of we don't expect anyone to know it all, but if you have kind of a baseline knowledge, it can frame up so many of those conversations. And there's, one of the challenges part of why I wanted to do this perspective on like whatever you want to call it, prepping, collapse, anarchy, whatever, has been really around this idea that there's so much content out there, especially on YouTube, that it's just like, if you don't know what you're looking for, it's very easy to get sucked into a lot of these pseudoscience areas. And I don't know much about over there, but at least over here, permaculture and regenerative agriculture is really fraught with like white supremacy and like the cottagecore movement and things like that. And it's only been in the last couple of years that there's been like a galvanized voice against that. And it's very much been a part of that, like it was hyper individualist prepper, like what you think of as prepper culture.
And I don't really want to gloss over it. When he says white supremacy, he doesn't mean like, Ku Klux Klan, like racist or anything like that. He's talking about like
there's some of that.
There is underneath, but it's not so overt. But from the most part, it's like the class status of buying this information and basically doing it as a hobby rather than treating it like a way of life, which is what it was for indigenous peoples. And I think that's the kind of white supremacy you mean so much. I think that's the part that's missed or sort of glossed over.
I mean, that is definitely a large component of it, but there's still like very much that like there's that show, what the hell is it called, Prepper
Little House on the Prairie?
No, the Prepper show. It was on like Discover or something like that, and then I think it's on Netflix now, and it's like awful. But it's like the stereotypical like prepper who's like preparing for an EMP, and they've got like a bug out house, and like they run drills with their 5-year-old kids carrying like ARs and shit like that.
That sounds traumatic. That sounds really cool.
And like
really good TV.
Yeah,
I love it.
And but like that
podcasts are so much better.
Yeah, that mentality though of like, the government's coming for me and I need to protect my family by buying 5,000 pounds of beans and, having chickens. And they have this very topical understanding of, oh, I've got chickens, but I've never really thought about what do I have to do to breed them? What's sustainable? How am I going to feed them when that 5,000 pounds of like cornmeal that I've got packed away someplace like is gone? It's this very like, I'm going to buy my way to outliving everyone else.
Right. And I also think there's an implication there that's unspoken, but basically they're waiting for somebody to show up and, save them. Like, I'll just wait it out. I'll wait the bad times out, and then somebody's going to show up and like help me out.
There'll be a purge or
right.
whatever.
Well, whatever. They're just going to ride out the bad times.
They're not planning on being part of building the new society.
Yeah.
Right.
Or building a society that moves back toward
right.
or something.
And that's the second step that sort of got me thinking, like, well, after shit hits the fan, which is a saying that gets thrown around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
After that happens, like, how do we take those next steps into rebuilding, and like, how do we basically get people to buy in, because you can't do it all by yourself. People are going to have to buy into these ideals in order to help you build a community and help you build civilization again, so to speak. I mean, hopefully it's not as epic as that. Hopefully it happens quickly. Like we've been talking about I've been reading a book about Tom Wessels. We're going to do an interview with him in a couple of weeks, and he talks about complex systems, which was our first episode. And that's such a broad, crazy topic to like cover. And I was like, dude, this is our first episode of a podcast. And we're going to try to break this down into bite-sized, digestible pieces that people are going to want to talk about. And I had a dream where basically it was just me talking to a wall, and that was me doing the podcast. And like, it was nobody was listening. I was just
I haven't given you any PTSD.
No, you totally have. Like I was super nervous about babbling on and on and on, and then I listened to it and it wasn't great, but I feel like we sort of got across the idea of what we were trying to do, and that conversation sort of builds on each episode after that, because that's the only way you can fix things, is by starting with the basis and then building on it. And I keep coming back to it, but I'm really a simple guy, and I like to keep things as simple as possible, and just having that approach to most things has sort of helped me learn a lot and taught me a lot, but it's also been like a safe way to go about learning things that I have no idea what I'm talking about.
That first episode of yours is excellent, and I highly recommend anybody go and watch it. And it definitely like listen rather, and it sort of reframed my thinking about the environmental crisis that we're in, and it's definitely influenced a few of the episodes we've done recently in terms of like
awesome
systems theories or like
it's just
I think like a lot of people, especially on the left, we all agree like what we're in isn't sustainable. Like eventually this capitalism is gonna do what it's going to do, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about, okay, then what? Like we always say like, oh, we need to change things, whatever, but then what? And that's kind of been our focus, is like, we can't just democratize companies and then keep doing the same things. That's not going to work.
Right. There should be a second part to of the saying where when the shit hits the fan,
then what?
Oh, who's going to clean it up?
Yeah.
Who's going to clean this shit up? Like somebody's got to do it. You know what I mean? And like, if we are going to be the ones that have to do it, then I want to go into it like sort of knowing what the hell I'm doing, rather than just kind of smearing it around. You know what I mean? Like I want to
make it worse.
I want to fix things. Yeah. I don't want to. Oh, it's in the rug. Like, what do you do? I don't know.
Can I just go back real quick and just ask, like, just for like a basic, like, I feel like when so many people hear about like prepping, or they just hear the word prepping, right? It is kind of like exactly what you're describing, like some dude in like Idaho who like, has buried a storage container or something and has a bunch of beans. Yeah. And like had some like questionable, like fundamentalist views perhaps. And then like, but like, obviously like what you guys are doing is a lot more practical, and it's a lot more like community based. Like it isn't just like isolate yourself, protect everybody, stockpile weapons, and don't let anybody set foot on your like landmine perimeter. Can you just talk about like how community comes into that a bit?
Sure. So I don't think anybody that's spent more than like 5 minutes thinking about like prepping, like, okay, I need to get food, and then I need to get this, and then you start thinking about all the things, and you're like, okay, well, when I run out of this, I'm going to grow this, and then I have to do this, and you start to realize pretty quickly that there's no way to do it alone, and there's a reason for that. Like we're not a species that's supposed to be solitary. We've lived in communities our entire existence, so this idea of trying to build those communities by having the resources available and to have a basic understanding of like how we can replenish those resources ecologically, while being ecologically minded, I think is really important. And part of really building those communities is acknowledging that not everyone in our community is going to have the same political views as us. I think especially because of the internet, we get really caught up in these like very esoteric conversations about like nuance and like, oh, you're a Marxist and I'm an anarchist. Like you're pretty much a Nazi, or, you know, whatever. Like that comes up so much on the internet. And it's like, okay, well, if you feel that way, then how are you going to build resilient, like, how are you going to build working class solidarity if you can't even like agree with somebody who's like 90% of the way where you are? So like one of the things I'm doing, I live in this like rural suburbs. It's a right to farm community, which just means you can farm there without like permits and stuff like that. But it's primarily like upper middle class white people that want a good school district and they just don't want to be around other people.
It's a privilege that they dole out to the towns that have property tax that's enough to justify it, basically.
Lower middle class people.
You can't in this state, you can't like just buy a house and start farming like your own food on it. Like the town has to say it's okay, basically, which is, you know, that's a different argument entirely.
And like, so one of the things that I'm doing is like I rotational graze my sheep and things like that, and I run them through my front yard. I do the same thing with my chickens, integrating chicken tractors into my front yard so people have to see it, with the idea of normalizing where our food comes from. And also in the next, I probably won't be there until another year or two, I'm hoping to start working with my neighbors to use their lands and try to normalize and build those connections within the community about what it looks like to create your own food and to relocalize your food within your community, and just kind of get the ball rolling on those types of conversations. Because again, none of my neighbors are going to be leftist. At best, they'll be liberals, and that's just the world we live in. And if you can't find those commonalities through showing these resilient models of primarily food systems, that to me, that's the way you connect with people. When we think about things like culture and community, it always usually comes down to food, and food comes down to your environment. You eat the things that are available to you in your environment, and that's where our cultures come from. And we're in this weird no man's land where food is available. You know, you can get strawberries 52 weeks out of the year and whatever, and our food doesn't come from any place local. And in order to build those communities, we need to start thinking about how do we redo that? How do we kind of go back to how things used to be in terms of knowing our neighbors, because they're involved in the things that we're involved with, whether it's food, community outreach, mutual aid, all of these different things. That's where you're really preparing for when those big supply chains collapse, which, you know, you can look at anything, you know, water, fertilizers, oil, I mean, you name it, like none of this stuff lasts forever. And at some point we have to reckon with what's left.
Right. And my approach is sort of similar to all of that, but slightly different. I've never really been like a one-man army or anything like that, but I have always tried my hardest to be self-sufficient and able to take care of myself. And after going through the rigmarole of going to college and getting a proper education and getting a job and all of that, I found that I was ill-equipped to actually do anything in my life without relying on, you know, the system that I was put into that makes it go better. I was just a cog and I wasn't really benefiting from anything. So I was like, well, it sounds like there's some things that I have to do. There's things that I have to learn in order to feel better about this. So where do I start? And then my, you know, simple brain, I want to reduce everything down into its parts and study them and then put it back together and see how it fits. And you do that with a big picture of, you know, how to fix our system and how to fix the United States and politics and all of this. And it's overwhelming. So I think that's how the Tom Wessels conversation sort of came into our first episode, because that gives you the right frame of mind. Like Dan, you were saying, like it helps you think about things a little bit differently. And I think that's what we were trying to get across was you have to realize that thinking big picture is very complex. And you have to start with the things that you can control and then organize, which is what you're talking about, Dan, how your podcast goes to the next level. And that's what I was saying. It adds a layer of complexity to it because of that organization where it goes from your community to the actual working class and like a bigger group of people, bigger sample size of people. That adds like a layer of complexity to it that I think it's hard to jump into that conversation without making generalizations and sweeping assumptions that you have to make sure people are on the same page in order to extrapolate, the right information from, or the message that you're trying to send across. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's one thing I was thinking about asking you, perhaps Andy, because it was something that you said on one of your podcasts. I'm not entirely sure which one it was about. I mean, you were just talking about small scale and focusing on small scale, and I immediately want to scale things. But that sort of like system of agriculture, I'm pretty sure I heard you suggest that there was a way of scaling that to some extent. Like, how would you start to like sort of scale that up such that it could accommodate the needs of larger metropolises to some extent? Or like, I mean, this is quite big picture thinking or long term thinking, but it's also this question of like the distinction between an agricultural country and the town kind of thing, which I feel like maybe is more of a big political divide in the US than it is here to some extent, although it does that divide does exist kind of thing. So if you have any thoughts on that, I don't know.
And I think that comes down to the carrying capacity, right?
Yeah, and
understanding where that is.
Yeah, so like you've got these I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Like opposite, I guess, perspectives where by increasing efficiency, you take the risk of losing the participatory and self-determination of those communities by trying to scale up. And it's kind of, where's that threshold where it no longer is good in terms of like the trade-off between that efficiency and the ownership of the community. And I don't know if there really is an answer. I think our sixth episode we did on the city and the role of the city in the future. Mm-hmm. We had talked a bit about kind of what
is that Catherine Tumber?
Yes, Catherine.
She comes up all the time in our episodes. We're talking about her in your episode now. It's a great book.
But her book about city resiliency,
Small, Gritty, and Green.
Small, Gritty, and Green. It's a great book. Highly recommend it. She kind of points to that cities generally are able to be self-sustainable in terms of like utilizing the farmlands around them. Seems to be up to about 100,000 people. That's where it starts kind of democracy starts to fade a little bit, and there's consolidations of power and the ability of the rural parts of the community to feed the cities starts to diminish. So, I mean, if you were talking off the cuff, I would say that's probably a good figure of where that kind of the trade-off between efficiency and density kind of, or loss of democracy kind of stands.
So that's very small scale. And
I mean, yeah, in terms of like,
you can scale it up,
outside of Boston.
Only so far. Cause I think we've kind of run the numbers on a couple of cities on how much space you need to support the city and what that actually looks like, how efficient that can actually be. And I don't know them off the top of my head, but they were pretty good. I mean, as far as like for a city like Boston where we live, there's a lot of people in a very small amount of space, but
in a cold climate.
Yeah, in a cold climate, and you can't do a whole lot there. But then you look at a city like Atlanta with a lot of space around it. It's a larger city, and you can grow a considerable amount of food for it with the land that's available around and in the city. Yeah, and that's just a, you can call it utopian look at the way the world could be, but what we're saying is it could work. And where do you start and how do we scale that is like kind of the problems that we're trying to get people to think about, so that maybe, out of the few people that listen to it, they'll have a conversation and maybe spark some ideas on how to fix this shit.
Sure. Yeah. I guess it's a case of like working out what units have sort of suggest themselves almost like, well, if you start with building your community around you, then you can start to work out like what things actually need to connect rather to like have a viable system. And like
and that's
who can we put in communication with who to like
and that's the level of complexity.
What kind of
that's the level of complexity that I was talking about, where you can work on your community and it can only get so large. 100,000 people will just throw that number around like, that's the cap. It's obviously not, but
it's conditional on environment. And, again, it depends on my personal opinion. We really haven't talked about it in the episodes yet.
Right.
Is I think the role of participatory democracy is far more important than size. And that also comes down to, the workload that the average person does, and that trade-off between technology and, I guess, ecological soundness, where there is a bit that the environment is willing to give for technology in terms of our mining and things like that. And what's the best return on energy invested so that we can reduce the amount of time people are working in menial jobs, and maximizing, in my opinion, we should have more people farming because it's good for people. That's what we're evolved to be in nature, so we should be in nature. And I think our food systems, to be resilient, have to replicate that. So I think that's far more important than like population density by itself, is that if you reduce those workloads, allow people to be more participatory in their democracies, then the sizes can be bigger. And unfortunately, there's it's a wild 3D matrix of all these different components that have to pin down to the very specific areas where Boston might be able to stay at its size, but New York City at per capita rates, even if it's the same density, might not, because of whatever other conditions they might have.
And I think that brings in the political aspect of it. I've never really been much into politics because it's just people arguing. In my opinion, they're just going back and forth with their opinion, and nobody's ever really right. But the way I look at it is the current system that we're in now. And Andy's always talking about collapse and it's going to fall apart and shit's going to be awful and what happens. But my whole point is if it's not working, you have to look at it and figure out why. And I feel like it's because of a divide and conquer approach, and all of our political arguments that everybody has. It's sort of label and break people down into groups, and then get several groups to agree, and that makes the majority, and then that's who wins. And there is no real right or wrong. It's just sort of a shit show. It's kind of like a circus.
I mean, Edward Abbey called it a tyranny of the majority. Or a tyranny of the majority, I think is the quote. Right.
So just because a majority of the people agree, it doesn't necessarily make them right. But that's okay, because it's not okay, but it can't last forever, because it gives the illusion that the right thing is being done, and it just sort of prolongs an issue or the solution to an issue coming around. And I started to realize that it's not divide and conquer isn't the approach we need. It's sort of division of labor that we need in order to help each other. And that sort of brought me to the Marxist way of thinking. And I read it all, and it all makes sense in theory, but I really wanted to see what it looks like in practice, and not really read about it and have it be like a theory that's lofty. I wanted to see what it looks like in practice, and it can be done, and it's not a threat to capitalism. You hear communism and Marxism thrown around in the States, and people bristle a little bit. And they're just theories that I feel like we are talking about in order to contextualize the way that we need to go about approaching our issues. And I'm not really, I don't know, I don't think of myself as a political person, but our podcast definitely has that voice to it, definitely when Andy is speaking.
Nice to ask you guys too about when you kind of try and open up these dialogues with people about where things might be going, or even just building more resilient communities, where do you generally advise people to start? Because obviously you can't get a bunch of people to just go toss together a chicken tractor, you know what I mean? Or
right.
Get a bunch of goats. An episode I was just listening to, actually, Andy, you were saying about if you were to just go get a goat and not do any research, you just wind up with a bunch of mud and angry neighbors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I know whenever people kind of ask me about just gardening and stuff like that, I always kind of just say it's a good place to start, just putting together some compost and just maybe getting some indoor plants and seeing how things grow and go from there. But is there something more about with more of a political aspect to it, or is it just just try and grow some plants? cook with something that you grew, or like, what do you guys usually say to start?
Yeah, I think it really depends on people's conditions in terms of what they have access to. It's here. I pretty much whatever they're interested in, I say yes, go do it, barring like buying a cow or something like very large. But like if people are like, I'm thinking about getting chickens, I'm like, do it. There's really nothing to it. It's not nearly as hard as the internet makes it sound. And one of the things, and we really haven't done much on livestock on the podcast, but I plan to, because like if you pick up a book on like raising chickens, it'll be like 2 inches thick and it'll cover about 30 different viruses and diseases they might get, and dealing with all these issues that chickens will experience. But if you let them live in their natural conditions, free ranging or intensively grazed where they're on new grass every day, I've never had to cull a chicken for health in my life. I've never had to deal with a disease and treat them in my life. So a lot of the complexity that we assign to things like agriculture come from the fact that we're mismanaging the way we're treating the thing we're trying to grow. I get messages all the time on the Instagram handle, and it's usually like, I want to, when are you guys going to do something on like gardening? And there's really not a lot to it, really. It's just doing it. Make sure it's wet but not too wet. Make sure the soil is, looks healthy. Does it look darkish and pretty healthy, like not sand and not clay? Then you're probably fine. It's not super complicated. And then when you understand things that we have covered, like making sure there's cover crops and things like that, that's when it becomes more complicated. But usually you're not doing that until after your first year anyway. Neither you enjoyed it or you did, and then you're kind of already halfway there. I generally feel like a lot of people get overwhelmed with the concept of things like gardening instead of just like jumping in, and it's just about taking that first step for a lot of people. And in terms of like mutual aid, again, it kind of comes down to what people are passionate about. You're not going to, I don't want to tell somebody to go volunteer someplace or go work as a medic at a protest if you're queasy about blood or whatever. Like everyone's got in anarchist theory, you'd say like affinity groups kind of guide where you would be placed in terms of your place within whatever kind of mutual aid you're trying to do. And that, that allows people to follow something they're passionate about. And by being passionate about it, you'll be better at it. You're going to absorb the information better. Just like you can listen to a podcast about biology and pick up everything because it's about agriculture and that's what you're interested in, but you could have failed biology in high school, even though it's the same exact information. Putting it in that context drives a lot of our ability to absorb the information.
Yeah, I think definitely whatever you're interested in, start there. And I think the important thing is to basically stay consistent with it and try to learn as much as you possibly can. You can't really half-ass learning things, but if you're truly interested, it doesn't really feel like work. It sort of is just what you do in your spare time whenever you get a moment to yourself, or whatever comes up in your daily life. You know what I mean? You get a few hours to decide what you want to do, invest it in what you're interested in, and it becomes a lot easier, not as daunting. But I think the one thing that you have to keep in mind is the big picture, and what your overall goal is to do is to learn this one thing so that you can incorporate, other things that you'll learn eventually and put it all together. That's kind of the mindset that I have, because I'm not good at any one thing, but I want to be like a jack of all trades, kind of like they say. Like I want to be able to know how to do as much as I can so I can be as useful as possible.
One of the things that you would sort of danced around because it's so like heavily laden into the sort of narrative of your show, but like I kind of wanted to double back on the idea of collapse kind of thing. And obviously I was speaking to Jack about this today because like by looking at American politics, it feels like it's at least more in the zeitgeist, or it feels like it's very present, whether it's like a crisis that comes about because of politics, say, or a crisis that comes about because of the state of the infrastructure, or the most obvious one is like the environmental crisis. I think for myself, I'm quite habitually optimistic which when it comes to like the environment, it's quite an unfortunate thing because the timescales are so short, and that's one of the scariest things about it. Whereas I'm usually minded to be like, well, we know what the crisis is, and we kind of know what the solutions are. So long as we kind of have some idea of what the solutions might be, I'm automatically like, okay, that's how we go and do it. It's the same as like rebuilding the workers' movement. It's like, okay, here's the big conceptual thing. I can sort of imagine the leap without doing the sort of conceptual work between.
Right. Right.
But for you guys, your podcast is obviously built a lot more around this idea of collapse for obvious reasons, and it's sort of like it sort of influences to some extent your politics. I feel that it's become very speaking from a state of pragmatism, perhaps. So I don't know. I was just going to ask, like, what kind of how do you envisage collapse? Because obviously, I don't think it's like a flick of a switch. It seems to be like it's a much more gradual thing. And then also, how do you feel about the fact that building a politics from pragmatism rather than, I don't know, what
like purity?
Yeah. I mean, when you put it like that, obviously, like pragmatism.
Do you want to go first?
To some extent, I'm putting the purity position here, but obviously, when you put it in terms of pragmatism and purity, like pragmatism seems like the place to start.
We've got so many different components that are coming together. It's hard to envision how it all kind of goes down. But if we look historically speaking, no civilization lasts forever, except we're looking at an interconnected global catastrophe, I guess you could say, when that time comes. And we're already seeing the pressures of global climate change and how it's impacting migration across the planet. You're seeing the extremes hit different parts of the planet. Here in the United States, if you're paying attention to like corn futures and things like that on the stock market, soy futures, everything's out of control.
Futures is such a ludicrous thing. Water futures.
Yeah.
The fact that really a big concept.
Yeah, it's interesting, but the writing's on the wall that things are changing, and I don't mean that from like a doomsdayer perspective, but like the food here in the United States has already been jumping like 15% in the last year. The government's subsidizing farmers to keep food on the table, but like it's just not working anymore. We've destroyed the soils, so it's just like there's a bunch of weak links that are somehow still holding together, and once one of them breaks, the rest of them are going to go. So I'm not sure. I think it's what we're going to see is we're going to continue to ratchet up. We had done an episode in August that we released like the week before the election here. And we had talked about kind of our predictions of what happens with the election. And we both had agreed that we thought Trump was going to win, which was actually, we thought, probably the better solution, because the alternative was that if Biden won. You don't think so?
That's not how I remember the episode.
We had
I must have been high as shit.
Yeah. We kind of agreed that if Biden had won, all it would do is allow the right to kind of recenter their politics on the far right, the new Trump. And we're already seeing that happen here in the United States. A lot of the QAnon stuff, and
right.
The
right slides right and the left slides more center is what we've seen over and over again. But it looks like a pendulum on the outside, but in reality, they've been sliding further to this.
And like what I think we're going to see though is the next probably 8 to 10 years, where we're going to have an open nationalist, even if it's a multi-ethnic, multinationalist party, or multi-ethnic nationalist party that is focused on a very weird matrix of what it means to be American. And we're starting to see that play out with things like the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and things like that, where they aren't strictly white, despite having white nationalist politics, where there's like these very specific exceptions to that rule that surround this idea of national identity. And as that builds momentum, it's going to be an interesting to see how liberals respond to that and how the left also responds to that, because we haven't done a very good job of responding to it on the left because of identity politics and the way it's been co-opted by liberals and things like that, which has just made this like really messy situation. And if you haven't listened to It Could Happen Here, I think he's got some pretty good ideas of what it looks like, and it's going to be a singular event that will kind of cascade into all these things that have been building up. And it'll be kind of like what happened in Portland, in the sense that like Portland is still having massive protests every day, but it's not on the news. It's not even of interest anymore. Cops just beating up people for protesting, firing tons of tear gas and all these other chemicals at them. And like this like illusion of normalcy that continues even 2 blocks down from where the protests are going on, except that on a wide scale. And eventually that's going to fall into our food systems and things like that. We're going to have these weird divisions and availabilities and things like that. That's at least how I kind of envision things going down the next decade or so.
That covers the political side of it. But I think in a more day-to-day aspect, with climate change, I think there's going to be more violent swings of weather that you'll see in the United States and all over the world. And I think that is going to hit our food systems in the next 10 to 15 years or so. And it's not going to be enough to destroy or like damage things to the point where I think there's going to be like mass scale famine or anything like that. But I think it's going to show that when there's a wide scale Katrina event happening, and it's not just Louisiana, it's a third of the United States, and the government doesn't show up and have a response to that. I think that combined with tumultuous political atmosphere, it's going to be not like a civil war in terms of North versus South or anything like that, but I think it's going to be a bunch of people clamoring for resources and control of what little resources they do have without the complexity of that organization where they can share things and make things better. It's going to be sort of that hoarding prepper mentality, which is what we're afraid of. We're trying to be like, it doesn't have to be like that. We can do it, but there has to be a division of labor, and everybody has to have the same sort of big picture idea in order for it to work.
Yeah, can I just
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go. Oh, thanks, man. I was just gonna say real quick. Like, I was listening to your went back and listened to your community self-defense episode today, and one thing that really hit me was like how often like collapse basically has happened even in like the last 20, 30 years. Like when you guys were talking about Katrina, I was just like, oh yeah, things did completely fall apart there. Like, you know what I mean?
It was a
like,
shit show. Yeah. And the government didn't show up for, longer than three weeks. It was longer than that. And it was the Bush administration at the time, and he caught a lot of flack and still does for that. But it wasn't so much that he didn't care. It was that the government didn't have a response. They had no response for what had happened. And that was that was just one city that's connected to the Gulf of Mexico that got hit. If it was, Houston and Galveston and all of the rest of the coast, like, these larger storms are going to be, because they're getting more powerful and they're one after the other now. We've seen it in the past 2 years. If it continues like that and hits more and more cities, then it's just going to be Katrina on a larger scale. And that's terrible. There's no response to it. And I think that's sort of what I alluded to with somebody's always waiting for somebody to show up with help. And even in a resilient system, you can't really fight against Mother Nature doing what it's going to do. But what I'm trying to say is, if there's multiple points of failure in the system that you're not comfortable with, then our job is to kind of
provide an alternative.
Just show an alternative, I guess. Instead of just saying there's a better way to do it, it's trying to figure out how we can do that and put it into play so that, average Joes like me and this guy over here can make a difference, at least in our neighborhood,
Yeah, and to talk about Katrina just a moment, one of the things I think that's really important to think about when that happened, and I just kind of alluded to it with the politics of future collapse and things, is that it turned into George Bush doesn't care about black people, but the conversation really should have been George Bush doesn't care about poor people. Like, he likes Condoleezza Rice, but he doesn't care about the poor people in those neighborhoods that were getting attacked by white nationalists. That's not even on his radar. He just doesn't care. And I think that's the conversation that we're on the left losing a lot of times to the liberals, in terms of like Obama, and so on that kind of have co-opted a lot of that language.
I think a lot of people simplify it into red versus blue or whatever political label they want to throw on themselves, and they forget that we're all citizens of the same country and we're all on the same side. And people get really fired up about the political ideologies, and I get it. But at the same time, you do have to remember keeping that larger picture in mind and making sure that that's a common thing that you share is an important part of having those conversations. And I feel like they get lost a lot. Or maybe not lost, but maybe just buried under a lot of emotion and passion about wanting to do what's right, that people forget that we're supposed to share the same common goal. And you have to kind of break it down and simplify it. And we're arguing for the same thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what if we're both right? Or what if we're both approaching this the wrong way and we can figure out a better way to do it? I feel like that doesn't really happen in those conversations. It's just sort of, you sound crazy, I'm right, and the other person's saying the same thing, and whoever shouts loudest or flexes the hardest sort of wins, I guess. But the conversation keeps repeating itself because that's all we're seeing.
The great mass of people are just onlookers who are just sort of like, you reveal yourselves to be like both crazy kind of thing.
Right. Right.
And just bouncing off of that, like, it does seem, as an outsider, like, it seems like the US state is more willing than most states, it would seem, to like abdicate responsibility when anything happens. Like, it always seems willing to retreat or remove itself, like, particularly when it comes to like things have happened to poor people.
I mean, unless they
we're not going to step in at all, kind of thing.
I was going to say, the United States only shows up when Uncle Sam has to collect, and it only comes down to collecting tax money. But when it comes time to spend money on the people they collect taxes from, they kind of drag their feet. And I think it's funny because people argue about healthcare in this country, and it's the same thing. We pay insurance companies, our premiums and all that. And we're mandated to have it by law, otherwise you get a tax penalty, so you pay anyway. And when something happens and it comes time for you to use your healthcare, they drag their feet and they're like, oh, this is a pre-existing condition, or, this bullshit, the medication's gone up now, even though you've already paid this much. And it's like, well, you only seem to care when my bill collects every month, but when I need, your help, which is what I'm paying you for, you don't really seem to show up. And it just keeps happening time and time again that at some point you're going to get tired of it, and like find a solution to it, or you're going to do what lazy people do, and that's find a scapegoat and blame somebody else for your shit not working the way that it's going. And I think that's the lazy excuse, and it happens time and time again. And I get it, because emotion, passion takes over that, what is it? Your frontal lobe. And as a rational adult, you have a properly working limbic system. You can take a step back and be like, this is how we have to approach this. Not removing emotion from it, but understanding where your feelings are coming from and sort of approaching it from a logical standpoint. That's how you fix things. That's how you approach fixing things. And I hope with this microphone I can get through to some people so that they will have the right mindset to approach fixing these problems without getting worked up so in emotion that they get wrapped up in having a conversation that they have good intentions of getting in, but it's mostly just emotional shouting. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure. Definitely. I mean, like, I think just to kind of like change the subject a bit, I definitely wanted to ask you guys a bit more about like community, like organizing, and about like what community self-defense could mean. And like, I don't know, because again, that's like another super, maybe not like charged phrase, but like nobody has any idea what it means, right? Because you get the like response of like, well, you're definitely not going to like stand up to like any kind of like local police force, which is like super true. Obviously, like the town that I'm from is like 8,000 people, and like our police department has like tanks, you know what I mean? But like at the end of the day, like it's kind of not really about that. And it's also like, I don't know, I was just wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about like what community self-defense means in like the modern era, because this isn't like 1848. We can just all go out and build barricades. And then if you could also just like talk to us a bit about like the role of guns and how to kind of like, how you kind of talk to people who have like maybe a little bit more of like a liberal attitude towards guns, and like, how those two things kind of connect, I guess.
So I think when people think about community self-defense, um, it is like you said, anything around firearms or self-defense when the state has that full authority on what it means to be able to defend a community. It is a real threat for a lot of people in terms of like how they think about community. We actually, just before we got on this, we'd interviewed Mitchell over at Armed Margins, who's fantastic and does a lot of community self-defense training and self-defense itself, community self-defense like projects. So we just happened to be talking about this, and
he does great work too.
He does do great work. If you're not familiar with Armed Margins, go check out his work, support it, all that good stuff. But this idea of community self-defense really boils down to this concept of having the authority to determine your own autonomy, and sometimes that's done with weapons. In the United States, we've had a very long history of community self-defense that's been mostly whitewashed from our history books. Like we think about Martin Luther King, the fact that he was denied the ability to carry a gun speaks to the value of that. Even somebody that we think of as like this preacher of nonviolence recognized the value of self-defense.
After he had a dummy grenade thrown through his window.
Yeah, that helps.
I'd kind of want to buy a gun after that too.
So, it's only been in the last 70 years or so that we've really whitewashed and created this aura around firearms that I think has made it very hard for a lot of people, like liberals that grew up, middle class or whatever, and kind of go through the motions of being anti-gun and then eventually becoming a leftist of some kind, and trying to rebuild that relationship or try to challenge that assumption that they made about guns. A lot of them are saying, or will say that, like, we live in a modern society that shouldn't need these things, or you can't beat the state with them. That's not really the goal. The goal is to be able to defend communities that are traditionally unable to rely on alternatives like the police, or just be able to defend and decide what their future looks like and how to defend their communities. It's not about replacing the police with an alternative, but providing that general protection from whatever it might be. And usually those communities of training of self-defense and building those networks within the community dig into deeper, more important, not to say that self-defense isn't important, but okay, people are breaking into our houses because they're stealing our food. Why don't we have enough food for the people in our community? And kind of digging into those deeper issues that usually stem from capitalism, but ultimately create a more communal sense of community.
Right. So the guns come into play in a very specific scenario in the society that we live in. A lot of people want to say that they get them for self-defense and things like that, but self-defense from what? And it's either domestic violence, or it's a crime related to theft of money, or
racism.
Very, very rarely do we have these acts of random violence, and when they do happen, they become the mass shooting events that we see time and time again, which is another problem entirely with white males and mental health that I don't even want to try to tackle. But I'm not even sure if it comes from not knowing where they fit in the socioeconomic ladder, where people work super hard and they still find that they need things just like people who work less than them. And I don't know, there's this weird hierarchy at play. And I think Andy asked the question if guns are anti-hierarchical. And I don't know, did we answer? Episode? Yeah, we answered yes and no, but it depends on the situation. So in a long roundabout way, I'm trying to say guns are a response to a certain situation, and ideally with the proper mutual aid and people getting help with the things that they truly need, guns just become a tool in the back of the toolbox to solve a deeper issue. And with mutual aid evolving into what it should and could be, the gun becomes a tool that gets buried to the bottom of the gun box, and you have more aid to help these people before these problems get to, critical mass like that. So that's the approach to mutual aid, and that's what makes it different than the police. It's not who you call when shit hits the fan and things have fully collapsed and you can't, save yourselves. Mutual aid is the idea of, I need this in order to prevent things from getting worse. And as mutual aid gets better, that those problems, instead of becoming exacerbated, they become smaller and smaller till eventually where it becomes mutual, not so much transactional like tit for tat, but if you help me out, this helps everything from getting worse.
Yeah, mutual aid is primarily around this idea of giving the person that is receiving the aid the ability to determine what they need. And that's a big component of that community self-defense, is giving those communities the ability to say, these are the things we need to protect ourselves, whatever that might mean, versus a police force that are a group of people that are not from a community coming in and standing as an authority figure instead of as a part of the community. There's no citizens arrests and things like that. As much as we like to pretend that there's some accountability for police, there isn't. And
it's not necessarily the situation of like, when bad things happen, who am I going to call instead of the police? That's not really the idea of mutual aid. But also,
it is a part of community self-defense.
But that's also when it comes down to, if you, over here, we have a right to have a gun. If you feel like you can't call the police, then you don't necessarily have to get anybody else involved. You can just buy yourself a gun at fucking Walmart or whatever, and Yosemite Sam, whoever the hell comes in your house uninvited. Yeah, guns are. I don't know. I got into guns because they're fun, and it's a hobby that I got into after fishing didn't really do it for me. It was too quiet, so I went with a louder hobby. And I don't have to worry about scaring the fish. But it was just something that I've always been into since I was younger. And I never, ever thought about having or needing a gun as self-defense. It's not something that I'm not going to say. It's something that's crossed my mind, but I've never worried about it. Let's just say that. And then after acquiring a couple of firearms and stuff like that, I do have a handgun that I carry with me every day. And it's not so much that I feel like I need it. It's just one of those things that I'd feel more comfortable normalizing it, rather than being that officer or the cop in uniform that walks around with his shiny badge and the big gun on his hip and says, "Oh, I'm here just in case." It's like, all right, I don't need you. Thank you. I'm good. I'm just going to go continue on my way. And that comes down to, I'm not even going to get into the thin blue line argument or anything like that, but I understand why the police are there. I understand that they're there to make people feel better. But my ideal society would be, you don't need to call them. And again, they become a tool in a toolbox. They get put down way in the bottom and they get all rusty and they're not needed because problems are properly being addressed. So ideally, that's my idealistic way of like looking at it. But I also live in reality and understand at some point motherfuckers disagree with you and it's time to go bang, bang, at least in the United States.
Sure thing. Yeah, it seems to me, as an outsider again, like, gun seems to have been incorporated into the American mindset, where it's part of the individual rights of an individual American kind of thing. Like, I'm going to have a gun and I'm going to defend myself, and it's just going to be me. Whereas, like, the narrative that came up in your episode on this was very much like, it's something that's incorporated into a community. It's not just I'm going to defend myself. It's how are we all going to defend ourselves? Yes, but also like come together and like work out a mutual understanding for how these things work, almost train together to some extent, and like
it's about
learn a sort of plethora of techniques for dealing with these things, whether it's sort of de-escalating an argument or
right
because it's part of that
tool. It's a tool to be used in certain arguments and our community self-defense. So again, we were talking about Katrina and how the police didn't have the ability to,
and in some cases actively were involved with attacking marginalized communities.
Right. They weren't making people feel safe. And so those people had every right as human beings to protect themselves from people who were clearly being aggressive and potentially were threatening harm. So that's a situation that, politics aside, that's it's a one-on-one situation, so to speak, where that's a small group of people with ideologies that conflict, and there's going to be a problem there. And you got to have the right tools in the toolbox for the job to be done safely. And I guess we talked about guns being equalizers. And in a situation like that, they're a deterrent from, one side being more aggressive than the other, I guess. And ideally, you are looking for a way out of the situation where everybody gets out safely. And I don't know. In situations where guns are in play, that goes away like immediately. So that's why it's so like scary and fucking frowned upon to bring guns into an argument or a situation. That's typically how people see it. But here in America, there are people who feel like their fucking rights are being trampled because they've been suggested to and advised to wear a mask just for the common good. And they're ready to get up in arms and pick up guns and march on the Capitol saying, your dictatorship and tyranny has gone far enough. And it's like, are you fucking serious? And they're like, hell yeah, we're serious. Like, we got guns. And it's like, God damn. Can I have one? Like, can I have a gun? Like, I disagree. I can't say that without a gun. So like, what do I do? But you totally can. But I don't know. What I'm trying to say is, as far as mutual aid goes, fucking guns should be at the bottom of the things that are required. And as long as the people who are asking for the mutual aid are able to dictate what they need in order to help their situation, I think things should work out, as long as it's getting to the root cause of the problem. It's very important to get to the root cause of the problem and not just slap band-aids on things to make them better, which is what the police does. They show up and it's a band-aid for the bad thing happening. It just sort of, it doesn't stop it from happening. It just sort of stops it from happening right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. And there's also, I feel like, definitely like an educational element too. You know what I mean? Where it's like, if you were to like get to a point, as like we're certainly getting to, at least in the States, of like everybody, or not everybody, but like large groups of people feeling like they need a gun for self-protection, like that, without the proper education, that just is just like, oh my God, that could just like potentially just be a disaster on so many different levels, whether it's like you're not educated in terms of like who your enemies should be, or like what you're actually fighting against, or just like not keeping your gun like in a safe place. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that comes down to what I was talking to earlier. That's an emotional response. That's somebody getting a gun based on, it's a fear response, rather than approaching the problem like, I feel like I need a gun, and asking yourself, fucking why? Like, if you don't feel like you can call the police and they'll show up and fix your problem, you've got bigger issues than not having a gun. You know what I mean? Like, your system that you live in that's been told that's going to keep you safe is failing you miserably if you feel like that. So that's bigger issues implied than just going out and getting a gun. Like, buying that gun doesn't make that problem go away. It's peace of mind, sure. What's that worth to you? Probably $600 plus a box of ammo. But does it really help you in the long run? You know what I mean? Like, the answer is fucking no. Not really. It doesn't make your problem go away. It's just an expensive Band-Aid. So you have to, realize that and remove your emotion. And yeah, it's scary and you're going to be afraid. If you are really afraid, thank goodness we live in a country, I guess, where you can go out and exercise your right. I guess at the end of the day, that should make you feel better. But at the same time, it should make you feel worse that you have a bigger problem to deal with now.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I have one specific question just really quickly about like, this is very like, I don't know if any of our listeners are going to care about this, but like, I've been trying to put together, like, Dan and I rebuilt our compost bins over at the allotment. What are you guys' like go-to like recipes, I guess, for like compost? Because like, I'm just kind of trying to keep it like 50-50 green and brown. Like, is there anything more specific you guys do, or anything to like kind of like speed it up or anything like that?
I use a lot of chicken manure because I have it from my chicken tractors, and I do have a chicken coop as well that I primarily use for like chicks and things like that while they're still little and it's too cold out. But that'll get it going. I also do a little bit of stuff with KNF, if you're familiar with Korean natural farming. There's a lot of amendments that you can add to soil, what's called IMOs, which are indigenous microorganisms, which you can add as an accelerant. And that's something you can do pretty easily and cheaply. I would say go to YouTube, because if you try to read about it, you're going to get overwhelmed, because I do every time and I understand it and I still get overwhelmed. But it's a very simple process once you actually like see it being done, and it doesn't cost much money. But it's a really great way to amend your compost to get it to go pretty quickly, and to get that compost that you want. Yeah, I'm hoping to do a series on KNF in the fall, and bring on a couple of guests that are like far more knowledgeable about it than I am. But it's essentially what we've talked about on the podcast, based like this idea of like you have this local biology in the soil, and essentially trying to raise it so that you can like create your own like colonies of it, and using that to try to accelerate processes and environments. So that's like the shortest, simplest way I can explain it.
Motherfucking micro high-Z boy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, that's really awesome. Keep up the good work. I mean, again, like Dan and I do legitimately like really enjoy the podcast. So it's been great to hear, and I think it's super important.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.